Arthur Ashe's strides to ensure equality for those who were discriminated against allowed the next generation of athletes to play desegregated sports instead of facing multiple racial and medical barriers. Athletes of the era after Ashe were not subjected to racial discrimination or judged unfairly by their limitations. Although the earlier generations of athletes were less successful in providing these benefits, Ashe was able to make an everlasting impact on the next generation of athletes. He did this by using his fame as an opportunity to speak out against discrimination. He did this by creating several foundations to fight AIDS and racism. He did this by encouraging victims of segregation to break through racial and medical barriers, which no athlete had done before. Arthur Ashe was born in 1943, during the era of equality struggles that were taking place in America. These struggles included, but were not limited to, racial discrimination, medical discrimination, and wealth inequality. Several athletes in the eras preceding Ashe made efforts to break down some of the aforementioned barriers for themselves, but the same struggles reappeared by the next generation. During the 1950s, most parks, schools, neighborhoods, and shopping areas were heavily segregated, and the tennis courts were no exception. Ashe was sensitive to these limitations, and as a result, developed the gracious behavior on the courts for which he later became known. Fortunately for Ashe, Dr. William Johnson took it upon himself to mentor and sponsor him, seeing a natural talent, stated biographer Christina Giroux. UCLA's Arthur Ashe Legacy website explains, upon graduating from high school first in his class, Arthur went to UCLA, which had one of the best college tennis programs. Playing there brought him more recognition amongst tennis enthusiasts. That year, he was also named to the U.S. Davis Cup team as its first African-American player. Following school, Arthur served his country, joining the U.S. Army from 1966 to 68. While stationed at West Point in New York, he eventually reached the rank of second lieutenant. During his time in the Army, he continued to play tennis, participating in the Davis Cup and other tournaments. Current Events magazine wrote, Ashe rose rapidly in the professional ranks, winning tournament after tournament. In 1968, he became the first black to win the U.S. Open, one of the biggest prizes in tennis.
I remember we went to a meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. Jesse Jackson was there, and from the back of the room he yelled up and he said, "Hey, Brother Ashe, you got to get a lot more outspoken." And Arthur turned and said, "Jesse, I don't do it with my mouth. I do it with my racket."
Arthur Ashe was born in racially segregated Virginia during the Civil Rights era. This was disadvantageous towards his goal to become a tennis champion, since tennis was a predominantly white sport. Ashe felt the discrimination against black athletes was severely unjust for him and many others, so he made it his mission to desegregate tennis. Ashe was precluded from competing against white youths in segregated Richmond during the school year, and unable to use the city's indoor courts that were closed to black players. Ashe stated in his novel, A Hard Road to Glory, "There were times when I asked myself whether I was being principled or simply a coward. I was wrapped in the cocoon of tennis early in life, mainly by blacks like my most powerful mentor, Dr. Robert Walter Johnson of Lynchburg, Virginia. They insisted that I be unfailingly polite on the court, unfalteringly calm and detached, so that whites could never accuse me of meanness. I learned well. I look at photographs of the skinny, frail little black boy that I was in the early 1950s, and I see that I was my tennis racket, and my tennis racket was me. It was my rod and my staff." In 1968, Ashe won his first major title at the U.S. Open. In 1975, Ashe defeated Jimmy Connors in the Wimbledon tournament, becoming the first and only black male to win Wimbledon. After his rise to popularity, Ashe was involved in several anti-apartheid movements and protests. Ashe was able to use his fame and influence to convince many Americans and South Africans that blacks and whites were truly equal. Ashe remains the only black man to win the singles title at Wimbledon, the US Open, or Australian Open. Over the course of his career, Ashe created and donated to multiple organizations that fought racial discrimination. These organizations gave African Americans a fair chance to be at the same level as whites in America, and the foundations continue to thrive. Ashe married Jean Mutusami in 1977, and they adopted a daughter, Kemera, 9 years later. One of the most pressing segregatory issues during the 1950s through the 1980s was racial discrimination. Many racially segregated athletes took steps to fight against the issue, but they failed to convince nations that segregation was harsh and unfair. Ashe used methods like advocacy and organizations to put blacks on the same level as whites. In late 1988, Arthur Ashe was diagnosed with AIDS. Although he did not reveal this to the press until April 1992, Arthur had a long battle with AIDS, including 3 surgeries. Ashe broke through this handicap barrier by continuing to speak out against people that segregated those who were affected by AIDS. He wouldn't have had to face that issue, but many previous celebrities with AIDS did not provide lasting benefits for future casualties.
America is mourning the passing of Arthur Ashe, the pioneering black tennis player who campaigned off the court for human rights and for AIDS research.
Ashe died in 1993 due to AIDS-related pneumonia, but no one after him was treated unjustly because of a disease that they had. Arthur tried hardest to inform people about AIDS. Arthur proved that AIDS was not a gay curse, but something that could actually be treated and seen as normal. Ashe also created and donated to organizations that provided benefits for sufferers of AIDS and HIV. His organizations were a key factor in increasing funding for researching HIV and AIDS, and his donations allowed for similar breakthroughs.
Just as I am sure everyone in this room has some personal matter that he or she would like to keep private, so did we. There was certainly no compelling medical or physical necessity to go public with my medical condition.
After being diagnosed, Ashe was unable to bring himself to announce that he had contracted AIDS because he knew that he would be segregated for his medical limitations. This was due to a lack of activism from athletes who had AIDS and chose not to do anything to help others who faced the same issue. Fortunately, Ashe made efforts to help victims of AIDS, allowing him to break down the medical limitation barrier.
I have an opportunity to play. I have an opportunity to be the best that I can be because of him, because of what he went through.
Arthur Ashe was born into a lower middle-class family in segregated Virginia. Tennis, to many Americans, was a sport for the wealthy elite, but Ashe disproved this by practicing constantly and persevering through the racial and medical barriers. He brought change to the sport and continued his activism off the court as well. Finally, he created opportunities for those who faced the same discriminatory issues, which changed the nation's view of segregation, both racial and ideological. The future generations of athletes and students were positively affected by Arthur Ashe. Ashe had the greatest impact on children who would make up future generations. Ashe was much more than a storied tennis player. He was an activist, author, educator, and a tireless campaigner for civil rights and racial equality, not only in the United States but worldwide, particularly against the apartheid systems of South Africa. Arthur was a voice for all the minorities, and that goes for women too, Pam Shriver told the New York Times in Ashe's obituary. He brought a level of conscience to the game, whether he was speaking on South Africa, or inner-city minorities, or exclusionary policies anyplace. Arthur's influence on tennis didn't fade after he left the sport. Although Ashe was not given equal opportunities at the time that he began playing tennis, he proceeded to make efforts which changed the future for many young athletes. Multiple athletes prior to Ashe faced issues, but did not voice their opinions.
They had this idea that tennis should be introduced to kids in the same way that basketball is introduced.
He called me at the base and I said, "You did it," his brother Johnny remembered in an interview with USA Today's Sandra Harwitt. All he would say to me is, "I'm a champion now and people will listen to me." That in itself tells you where his head was at. He wanted to be a voice and to make a difference. Ashe made an everlasting impact because he fought hard to voice the opinions of segregated people across the world. He was a victim who faced 2 different forms of discrimination. He was an activist who broke down those barriers for future generations of athletes. He was Arthur Ashe, a true champion.
Sometimes do you wish you could stop and get off and look back and see what's happening to Arthur Ashe?
Yes, but I really don't want to do that. Sometimes you wish you could, but on second thought, it's not too good because you don't want to look back. I always look forward to the rest of today and tomorrow. What's in the past is past, and there's water under the dam, and you learn from your mistakes, and you must go from there.